A frail elderly woman, her hands trembling, clutched a worn paper bag tightly, as though it held her last shred of security. She could never have imagined that a routine trip to the bank, her bank of over 30 years, would become a nightmare. Her loyalty meant nothing in the face of a cold, impersonal policy she couldn't navigate, the requirement of a smartphone app she didn't own nor understood. The humiliation began immediately. Eyes from both staff and customers cast judgment, their cold stares stripping away her dignity. Her polite requests for understanding were met with indifference. Each refusal, each dismissive glance pushed her deeper into despair. She felt the weight of the world pressing down, her confidence crumbling under the gaze of a system that had left her behind. And just as hope seemed lost, a stranger stepped forward, a towering presence that commanded attention. It was Shaquille O'Neal, an NBA legend who had once dominated courts, but now used his influence to fight for the overlooked and forgotten. His arrival changed the atmosphere instantly, his kind words and powerful advocacy cutting through the coldness that had enveloped the room. The moments that followed were more than just an act of kindness. They were a reminder of humanity's potential to stand up against injustice. What Shaquille O'Neal did next challenged everyone in that room to rethink their actions and attitudes. It was a powerful call to action, a testament to the strength found in compassion and standing up for what's right. Intercom crackled. "You're disturbing other customers. I'll have security assist you." Two security guards approached, one tall and imposing, the other shorter but equally firm. "Ma'am, please step outside," the taller guard said, his tone polite but unwavering. Helen's knees felt weak as she fumbled to gather her scattered documents. Her trembling hands betrayed her, and the papers slipped from her grip, cascading to the marble floor. Prescriptions, a veteran's certificate, and a faded photograph of her and George spilled out of the worn bag. The quiet murmurs in the bank grew louder. An elderly woman whispered to her companion, "This is unacceptable. How can they treat her like that?" Yet no one moved to help. The guards hesitated before bending down to collect the scattered items. They handed the papers back with stiff politeness. "Please leave immediately," the shorter guard said, his voice sharper this time. Tears streamed silently down Helen's face as she shuffled out into the glaring afternoon sun. Outside, she sank onto a nearby bench, her frail frame sagging under the weight of exhaustion and defeat. She clutched the documents, now crumpled and smudged, trying to steady her trembling hands. Among them, the prescription, a utility bill, and the old photograph of her and George stared back at her, each telling a piece of their shared story. In the photo, George stood tall and proud, a young soldier in a crisp uniform, his arm draped protectively around her shoulders. They had faced so many challenges together, from raising children to weathering life's storms. But now, as George battled his illness, Helen felt utterly powerless to help him. She bowed her head, shoulders shaking, tears falling freely. The flip phone inside her bag remained silent, a stark symbol of her helplessness in this modern world. How could they treat me like this? She wondered, clutching the bag as though it held answers to her unspoken prayers. Inside the bank, voices of discontent began to murmur. A middle-aged man muttered, "She's been a customer here her whole life. This is disgraceful." But still, no one stepped forward. Outside, Helen remained on the bench, her gaze fixed on the papers fluttering at her feet. A light breeze carried some away, teasing her weary endurance. She reached out, desperately trying to retrieve the prescription for George's medication, but her hands betrayed her again. She lost her balance, clutching the bench for support. Her eyes fell once more to the photograph, its edges worn from decades of handling. She picked it up, holding it tenderly, as though George himself were within reach. In her memory, he was always the strong one, her unwavering pillar. But now, cancer had reduced him to a shadow of his former self, and Helen, in her frailty, felt as though she were failing him when he needed her most. She couldn't do anything for him, nothing but sit there, powerless and bewildered. "How could this happen to me?" Helen whispered to herself, her voice barely audible over the rustling breeze. "George needs me. He's always been there for me through every hardship, and now, I can't do anything for him." Quietly, Helen wiped her tears, but the weight of humiliation lingered. The scene at the bank replayed in her mind, cutting into her self-esteem like a blade. She had lived an honest, hard-working life, carefully managing every step. How could it come to this, to be treated like a burden, discarded by a place she had trusted for over 3 decades? Inside the bank, transactions continued as usual, but unease rippled through the room. A middle-aged man in line shook his head, his expression disapproving. "This is unacceptable," he murmured to the person next to him. "She's been banking here her whole life, and they treat her like this?" The woman beside him nodded. "They should be helping her, not throwing her out like that." But their indignation remained confined to whispers, quiet voices that held no power to change the situation. Outside, Helen stayed on the bench, her frail figure hunched as she tried to collect herself. Papers still lay scattered near her feet, and the world seemed indifferent to her plight. A shiny black SUV pulled into the bank's parking lot, its sleek exterior gleaming under the afternoon sun. The door opened, and from the driver's seat stepped a tall, confident man with a calm yet commanding presence. It was Shaquille O'Neal, the legendary NBA star, known not only for his athletic feats, but also for his acts of kindness and advocacy for those in need. Beside him stood his teenage daughter, Mahira, her curious and intelligent eyes scanning the "Dad, look," Mahira whispered, tugging on Shaq's hand and pointing toward the bench where Helen sat. "Something's wrong with her." Shaq followed her gaze, his expression shifting as he noticed Helen's frail figure. She was hunched over, her shoulders trembling, and her face marked by deep lines of despair. The papers around her fluttered lightly in the breeze, some still on the ground. Her tear-streaked cheeks and red-rimmed eyes told a story he couldn't ignore. Without a word, Shaq walked toward her, his towering presence casting a long shadow over the bench. Startled, Helen looked up, her tear-streaked face glancing at him in confusion. She quickly wiped her cheeks with trembling hands, unsure why this stranger had approached her. "Are you okay?" Shaq asked, his deep, resonant voice warm and gentle, a stark contrast to his imposing appearance. Helen hesitated, her gaze flickering between him and the ground. After a moment, her voice, shaky but filled with desperation, broke the silence. "I just wanted to withdraw money from the bank to buy medicine for my husband," she explained, her words catching in her throat. "But they wouldn't let me. They said I need a smartphone." Shaq bent down, carefully gathering the scattered papers around her. Among them was the old photograph of Helen and George. He held it for a moment, studying the young soldier's proud smile and Helen's bright, hopeful expression. His gaze softened, a flicker of empathy crossing his face. He had seen injustice in many forms, and this moment weighed heavily on him. "How long have you been banking here?" Shaq asked, his tone steady yet layered with meaning. Over 30 years, Helen replied, her voice trembling. Never had any problems before, but now. Her words faltered, her emotions overwhelming her once more, as tears welled in her eyes. Mahira watched the interaction quietly, her eyes reflecting both concern and admiration as she stepped closer to her father. Standing up for her sick husband. Shaq's voice was calm but carried a weight that made the entire room fall silent. The young teller fumbled with her words, her face growing pale. I'm just following procedure, sir. It's not up to me. Shaq straightened up, his imposing figure seeming even larger as he glanced around the bank. Policies are meant to serve people, not make their lives harder, he said firmly. Where's the manager? Let's resolve this right now. A nervous hush swept through the room before a middle-aged man in a sharp suit hurried over from an office in the back. He adjusted his tie nervously as he approached, recognizing Shaquille O'Neal immediately. "Good afternoon, Mr. O'Neal," the manager said, forcing a smile. "How can I assist you?" Shaq gestured toward Helen, who stood beside him, clutching her documents and looking overwhelmed. "You can start by explaining why this woman, your customer for over 30 years, was denied access to her own money. She just needs it to buy medication for her husband. What kind of bank does this?" The manager's forced smile faltered. He looked at Helen, then back at Shaq, clearly uncomfortable under the scrutiny of the towering man and the onlookers, many of whom were now recording the exchange. I'm sorry for the misunderstanding," the manager stammered. "It's true we've implemented new policies to enhance security and streamline services, but perhaps we overlooked certain accommodations for long-standing customers." "Overlooked?" Shaq's voice deepened, his brow furrowing. "This isn't about oversight. This is about treating people with basic decency. Mrs. Thompson deserves better than this. Fix it." The manager nodded hastily and turned to the teller. "Pull up Mrs. Thompson's account immediately," he instructed, his tone sharp, "and assist her with whatever she needs." The teller, visibly flustered, began typing quickly, avoiding Shaq's piercing gaze. Within moments, she handed Helen a slip to sign and processed her withdrawal. "Here you go, ma'am," the teller said softly, sliding a small stack of cash across the counter. "I'm sorry for the inconvenience." Helen's hands trembled as she picked up the money, her voice barely audible as she whispered, "Thank you." But Shaq wasn't done. Turning back to the manager, he added, "You need to make sure this doesn't happen to anyone else. Review your policies. Train your staff to treat people like humans, not numbers." The manager nodded again, visibly humbled. "We will, Mr. O'Neal, I assure you." Shaq turned to Helen, his expression softening. "You have what you need now?" Helen nodded, clutching the cash tightly. Her eyes shimmered with tears, but this time they were tears of gratitude. "Thank you," she said, her voice cracking. "I don't know how to repay you." "You don't need to," Shaq replied gently. "Just take care of your husband." As Shaq and Margus guided Helen out of the bank, the crowd inside erupted into murmurs of admiration and applause. For the first time in what felt like hours, Helen smiled, a small, grateful smile, as the sunlight hit her face. She looked up at Shaq and Margus, feeling something she hadn't felt in a long time. Hope, voice slightly shaking. "I'll make an exception this time." She turned to the teller and instructed, "Process her transaction immediately." The teller nodded hurriedly and began entering the necessary details, avoiding eye contact with anyone. Within moments, she handed Helen the cash with a quiet, "Here you go, ma'am." Helen's hands trembled as she took the money, clutching it tightly to her chest. Her voice was barely above a whisper as she said, "Thank you." Tears welled in her eyes, but they were a mix of relief and gratitude. Shaq, standing beside her, gave a slight nod and turned his attention back to Rebecca. "You made the right choice," he said firmly. "But remember, people like her, your loyal customers, shouldn't need exceptions. They deserve respect and dignity every single day." Rebecca, visibly shaken but trying to regain her composure, nodded. "I'll review our policies," she replied softly, more to herself than to him. As Shaq and Helen turned to leave, the crowd in the bank erupted into applause. Some customers approached Helen, offering words of support and encouragement. A few even stepped forward to shake Shaq's hand, thanking him for standing up for what was right. Outside the bank, Helen paused for a moment on the steps, looking at the cash in her hand, and then up at Shaq. "I don't know how to thank you," she said, her voice quivering with emotion. Shaq smiled warmly. "You don't need to thank me. Just take care of yourself and your husband." Mahira, who had been quietly recording everything on her phone, stepped closer to Helen and gave her a small hug. "You're stronger than you think," she said with a smile. "Don't ever let anyone make you feel small." Helen's lips trembled into a faint smile as she looked at the father and daughter standing before her. For the first time in a long while, she felt seen, not as a burden or a problem, but as a person who mattered. "The medication for you," the clerk said, handing her a small white bag. Helen clutched it tightly, her relief palpable. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice quivering with emotion. As she paid with the money she had fought so hard to withdraw, she couldn't help but reflect on the kindness of strangers who had stepped up when she felt most abandoned. She left the pharmacy with a renewed sense of determination. Helen returned home to find George resting in his chair, his frail form illuminated by the soft afternoon light streaming through the window. She approached him, holding the bag of medicine as if it were a precious treasure. "George," she said softly, her voice steady despite the tears threatening to fall, "I've got what you need." George looked up at her, his tired eyes sparking with gratitude and love. "You always come through," he said with a faint smile, reaching for her hand. Helen knelt beside him, clutching his hand in both of hers. "We're in this together," she whispered, her voice firm. In that moment, the weight of the day began to lift. Helen realized that even in the face of hardship, there was still hope. Hope brought to life by compassion and the courage to stand up for what's right. And as she sat there beside George, she silently thanked the tall man with the big heart and the bright-eyed girl who had reminded her that she was not alone. Reviewed its policies, implementing a new system that balanced modern security measures with accessibility for all customers, regardless of their technological proficiency. A public apology was issued, acknowledging the oversight and reaffirming the bank's commitment to serving its community with empathy and respect. Helen, unaware of the larger waves her story had created, focused on caring for George. His health gradually began to improve, and the medicines seemed to be helping. One afternoon, while sitting by his side, she received a knock on the door. It was Rebecca Stevens, holding a bouquet of fresh flowers and an envelope. Helen opened the door cautiously, her expression softening upon recognizing the woman. "Mrs. Thompson," Rebecca began, her tone earnest, "I came to apologize personally for what happened at the bank. It was wrong, and I hope you can forgive us." Helen hesitated, then nodded, taking the flowers with trembling hands. "Thank you for coming," she said softly, her voice heavy with emotion. Rebecca handed her the envelope. Inside is a letter from the bank's leadership, along with something to help cover any costs you've incurred due to this ordeal. We've also created a hotline for customers like you who may face similar challenges in the future. Helen opened the envelope and found a handwritten note expressing sincere regret, along with a voucher for future transactions. She looked up at Rebecca, her eyes brimming with gratitude. "Thank you," she said, her voice steady. After Rebecca left, Helen turned to George, who smiled faintly from his chair. "See," he said, his voice soft but steady, "there are still good people out there." As the days passed, Helen's story continued to inspire others. Communities began advocating for more inclusive practices in local businesses and banks, while Mahira's video became a symbol of the power of compassion in action. Helen would often reflect on that pivotal day, not just on the challenges she faced, but on the strangers who stepped in to make a difference. It reminded her that even in moments of despair, humanity's capacity for kindness could light the way forward. Love isn't just about the happy moments. It's about standing together through the storms, holding on even when the world seems to fall apart. That's what makes it real and lasting. Mira nodded, her expression thoughtful as she returned the photo to its place on the shelf. The room felt alive with a quiet warmth, the kind that only comes from shared understanding and genuine care. Shaq turned to George, his deep voice carrying a reassuring tone. "You've built something incredible here, a life filled with love and resilience. People like you remind us what really matters." George chuckled softly, his voice rasping but still full of spirit. "And people like you remind us that the world still has good folks willing to help." Shaq smiled, reaching into his pocket and pulling out a small card. "If you ever need anything, anything at all, don't hesitate to call. Mahira and I are just a phone call away." Helen took the card, her hands trembling slightly. "Thank you," she said, her voice breaking. "For everything. You've given us more than help. You've given us hope." Mahira leaned down to hug Helen, her youthful energy seeming to infuse the room with optimism. "You've inspired me, Mrs. Thompson. I promise I'll carry your story with me and share it with others. It's too important not to." As Shaq and Mahira prepared to leave, Helen and George stood at the door, waving goodbye. The couple watched as the towering man and his daughter walked away, their figures framed by the fading evening light. Helen turned to George, her hand finding his as they stood in silence for a moment. "It's amazing, isn't it?" she said softly, "how a single act of kindness can ripple out and touch so many lives." George nodded, his eyes reflecting the depth of his gratitude and love. "It's more than amazing. It's a reminder that no matter how hard things get, we're never truly alone." As they closed the door and returned to their cozy home, the sound of laughter echoed faintly from the street outside, a testament to the bonds that had been formed and the lives that had been changed by one simple, selfless act. Let her with a soft smile, her fingers gently tracing the words. She felt a deep sense of validation, knowing that her struggle had sparked real change. The flowers were a beautiful touch, a gesture of humility and respect that touched her heart deeply. As she placed the letter down, her eyes welled with tears, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming gratitude she felt for everything that had unfolded. It had been a long, hard journey, but it had led to something meaningful, not just for her, but for others who would benefit from the bank's new approach. George, still resting in his chair, glanced up at her as she placed the bouquet on the table. "What's that?" he asked weakly, his voice raspy but filled with curiosity. Helen looked at him, her smile radiant. A letter from the bank, an apology, and a promise that things are going to change. "I think we've made a difference, George." He reached out for her hand, his eyes filled with pride. "You always did, Helen, even when you didn't know it." Helen nodded, squeezing his hand gently. "Maybe. But this time, I think everyone's going to see it." The following days brought a new sense of calm to their lives. The community support continued to pour in as Helen and Shaq's story inspired more people than they could have ever imagined. The video Mahira had uploaded kept gaining traction, spreading across social media platforms, touching hearts, and sparking important conversations about compassion and fairness. At First Capital Bank, the changes had already begun to take shape. Special programs were launched to ensure elderly customers or those unfamiliar with technology would receive the assistance they needed. Employees underwent training to foster empathy, making sure that each person was treated with dignity and respect. One afternoon, as Helen sat by the window, the phone rang. It was from Rebecca Stevens, the branch manager. "Hello, Mrs. Thompson. I just wanted to check in and personally thank you again for everything. Your actions have not only changed our policies, but have truly changed the way we see our role in the community." Helen's voice caught in her throat as she listened, feeling a sense of accomplishment and peace. "I never expected anything like this. It's just the right thing to do, you know." Rebecca's voice softened. "And that's exactly why we needed to hear it. I can't thank you enough, Mrs. Thompson. You've reminded us all what it really means to serve others." The call ended, and Helen placed the phone down slowly. She looked out the window, her heart full of emotion. She knew that the changes wouldn't just help her, but many others in the community, people who had struggled quietly, often unseen, just like she had. She glanced over at George, who was resting peacefully, and whispered softly to herself, "This world may still have its challenges, but it also has people like Shaq, like Rebecca, people who remind us that compassion can always win. And you know, the compassion of all the people who stood by us. They made all the difference." George gave her hand a reassuring squeeze. "It's not just the big moments that count, Helen. It's the little ones, the quiet acts of love that make the biggest impact." Helen smiled through her tears, her heart full. "I used to think we were just two people in a big, noisy world, struggling to make it through. But now I see how much good can come from just a little kindness." As the children and community members slowly left, their smiles and words still fresh in their minds, Helen and George remained seated in the warmth of their home. The room felt different now, brighter, fuller, filled with the memories of a story that had touched so many. They had never imagined their love would lead to something this big, but here they were, seeing the ripple effects of their quiet sacrifices and the people who chose to stand with them. "Look at all of this, George," Helen said softly. "Our love, our lives, it's all had a purpose." George nodded, his voice steady but full of meaning. "We may have started as just a small part of this world, but we've done more than we ever dreamed we could." They sat together, the weight of their shared history and the incredible turn their lives had taken settling in. Through all the challenges, through every hardship, they had held on to what mattered most, each other. And now, because of that love, their story was a beacon for others. In their hearts, they knew this was only the beginning, and for the first time in a long while, they were certain that the future held only more possibilities of kindness, compassion, and change. Helen and George's story didn't stay confined to their small house. It spread far and wide, becoming a symbol of kindness, love, and resilience. Despite the challenges they faced, Helen understood that compassion has the power to overcome anything. Their story serves as a testament that, in a world increasingly driven by technology and rigid systems, compassion and humanity remain guiding forces. It wasn't just Shaquille O'Neal's help that made a difference. It was their story that inspired the community to remember that people are not meant to serve rules. Rules are meant to serve people. The love and sacrifice Helen showed for George, paired with Shaq's compassion, teaches us that even small acts can change lives, and sometimes even entire communities. From seemingly ordinary moments, we can make a significant impact as long as we prioritize compassion above all. This story is not just about a couple or a bank. It's a reminder that, in any circumstance, we have the power to become beacons of hope. Even the smallest act of kindness can create a ripple effect. The world will always need brave individuals who stand up for what is right. If Helen, George, and Shaq's story has touched your heart, share it with others. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel so we can continue to bring you more inspiring stories like this one. Together, let's build a community where compassion is always the priority. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.